Hi, I'm John Kursky, and in this video I'm going to show you how to weave DataOps into Microsoft Fabric. Now, Microsoft Fabric over the past year has introduced some wonderful features that increases your cycle time and decreases the number of errors you put into production, also known as the DataOps mantra. Now, I'm going to do that in two videos. The first video is going to be on the principle of make it reproducible. This is where we're going to get version control into your Microsoft Fabric project. The second video is going to be on quality is paramount, which is going to show you how to get a testing framework into your Microsoft Fabric project. Now, the first video that we're going to see is made all possible with the new PBIP format. Enjoy.
All right, so to get started with version control, I'm going to show you how to do that in 6 steps. The first is to set up and save in the new PBIP format. The second is to explore the contents of the PBIP format. We're then going to set up an Azure DevOps project to support the PBIP file. And then we'll set up Git integration in a Fabric workspace, demonstrate those changes to a PBIP file and how those are tracked, and finally demonstrate the syncing to a Fabric workspace. Now keep in mind, in order for this steps 4, 5, and 6 to occur, this is going to require a Fabric workspace. Okay, so in order to save a Power BI file to the new PBIP format, you must be on one of the latest releases of Power BI Desktop. Now this is going to require you to download and update your Power BI Desktop file, but in this video I'm going to show you what it looks like in the November 2023 release. So the first thing you're going to do is go to the Options, and then when that appears, you're going to need to go under your global settings to the preview feature, and you're going to specifically look for the Power BI Project Save option, and you're going to make sure that you click that option. Now, this may require you to restart Power BI Desktop, but after you do so, you'll now have the ability to save to the PBIP file. All right, so once you have that set up, here I have an example Power BI file. And if you go to File and Save As, you're going to see a new option for your PBIP file that you can use. So you'll just click PBIP, just to show you PBIP. And then you'll obviously pick your location to save it. And then that's it. That's how you save it to the PBIP format. So in the next step, we're going to explore a little bit of the PBIP format. All right, so let's take the time to explore the PBIP format. Now, unlike the PBIX file, when you save to PBIX, you'd see one file. When you save to PBIP, you're going to see multiple files saved to the folder. The first, obviously, is the PBIP file. Now, this is what's going to help open that Power BI file in Desktop when you double-click on it. The other files is where you're actually storing the information about your Power BI file. So the first one here on the left is your data set. So this has all the contents of your data set in file formats, which makes it really easy to save it to Git or do version control with Git. You'll have your model.bim file, you'll have your representation of your layout file, and even, and we'll do this a little later, any of the DAX queries with the new DAX query feature that was released in November will be saved to this folder in your dataset folder. You'll also notice there is a .pbip file in here. This is where we're actually storing the data that is used in your Power BI file. Now, for the Power BI file saved to Git, this is actually excluded so that when you are doing your version control with Git, the data itself is not stored in the Git repository. And this is really helpful when you're working with something like row-level security and you don't want to expose that data file to the rest of your team if they don't need access to that information. Let's move back up here to the report. Now, the report here has a bunch of different files in it, including the report.json file, which is the JSON representation of your visuals in your Power BI report. It also stores your custom visuals that you have, as well as any of the images that you may be bringing into your Power BI file. Finally, if we take a look at the getignore file, and I'm going to open this up in Visual Studio and bring this over, you're going to see that you have the local settings and this cache.abf file. That is, again, your data file that you use to store the information that you have when you hit a refresh on your data set. This is excluded from the version control in Git so that you're not accidentally doing any data leakage, or if you have row-level security and your other team doesn't need access to that information, this prevents the data from being exposed in your version control system. All right, so that's exploring the PBIP format in a nutshell. The next step we're going to do is set up Azure DevOps to save the PBIP file into version control. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to set up an Azure DevOps project to support syncing your PBIP format to a repository in Git. Now, what you see on the screen here is a sample Azure DevOps project. You do need Azure DevOps in order to support this step. Now, I am going to show you how to set up the repository. So what you're going to do is click on the repository feature. And I have not set up this repository just yet, so the first thing you're going to want to do is go to the bottom here and click the Initialize button. Now this is going to set up your first file for your repository, which is just a README file. This is where you store your instructions. And then up at the top here, you're going to click the Clone button. And since I'm using Visual Studio Code, and I would recommend that you do too, you'll click the Clone in VS Code button. You will get prompted to open in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to hit the Open button. And then you're going to get asked to save to a folder locally on your machine. So I have a Git folder here, and I'm going to just select the repository destination. Now this may take a couple seconds. You'll get prompted, would you like to open your new cloned repository? I'm going to hit the Open button. All right, now that we have our Git repo cloned to our local machine, we want to save our PBIP file to this folder in order to sync back to Azure DevOps. So the easiest way to do that is to go back to your Power BI file, go to hit Save As. I like going to the Browse this device. I'm going to paste in the file path, go to the PBIP Summit Git demo, and hit save. Now if I go back to Visual Studio, you'll now see that we have a bunch of files here in green that indicate there's an update. Now if I want to sync this back to Azure DevOps, I can click on the Source Control button. And there's a two-step process to commit your PBIP file to your local repository, which is on your machine, and then syncing that back to the repository into Azure DevOps. So you're always going to commit and then sync. So the first thing you're going to do is type in a comment. I'm going to put in just initial load here, and then I'm going to click on the commit button, and then you'll see that it has changed to a sync changes. I'm going to hit sync changes. Now, depending on the size of your files or the contents in your repository, this can take anywhere from a couple seconds to a couple minutes. Now, if we navigate back to the Azure DevOps repository now and hit refresh, you'll see that the contents of the file for the PBIP has now been synced back to your repository. Now, what's great about this is other folks can then clone that repository and make changes to the file and then resync that back to the repository here, and you'll be able to see what individual changes have occurred to those files. Now, we'll get to that a little bit later in this demonstration, but for now, just understand this is a way that you can keep your information about your Power BI file in sync in version control and have people work on it in parallel if need be. So now that we have set up an Azure DevOps repository to store our PBIP file, we want to now set up a Fabric workspace to connect to that Azure DevOps repository. So let me show you how to do that. So under Workspaces, you can click the New Workspace in the Power BI service. And under Advanced, you'll definitely want to make sure that you're in at least the trial or the Fabric version. This requires a Fabric workspace in order to work. And we'll just call this PBI Summit Get Demo and hit Apply. So once the workspace has been created, we're going to want to click on Workspace Settings. And there's a couple options here, and the one we're going to want to click on is the Get Integration option. Now, since this is already connected to my my tenant ID and my user account, I can actually pick the project and the Git repository already from my drop-down menu. So if I click on the organization, click the project, we'll have to scroll down a little bit to the PBIP Summit Git Demo, select the repository, and here you have a choice to select branch. Since we only have the main branch here, I'm going to just select main branch for the purpose of this demo and hit connect and sync. Alright, so once it has synced, you will see that we have our report and our data set, aka the semantic model, has now been automatically synced to our Fabric workspace. Now the great thing about this is now that we have our Git integration here, we can start tracking changes, which I'll show you in our next step. Alright, so let's make a couple changes to our Power BI file and show how we can track those changes in Git version control. So I've got the sample model up here. Let's make a change to one of the DAX measures, a very simple change. I'm just going to add a +1 here. You can see all I've done is add a +1. Save that. See that that number changed. And then let's go ahead and add a new tab and put in a new visual here, right in the middle. Very simple change that we've made. And the next thing we're going to do is hit the Save button. Now, if I go back to Visual Studio Code, you're going to see that there's a couple files that appear in the version control window that say they have changed. So we have the model.bin file that has changed and the report.json file that's changed. Now, in the model.bin file, you'll see in Visual Studio Code, it does a nice job of doing a comparison since these are in plain text files now and not in a PBX file, which is zipped up in binary, we can actually explore what changes have occurred to the files. So you'll see here on the left, this is what it was, and on the right, this is what was changed. And you can see very simply that a +1 has been changed. Now, this is a little more straightforward in the model.bim file. In the report.json file, this is a little bit like reading the matrix code. But if I scroll down, you can see that a new page was added in the new version of the PBIP file. Now, these changes are in what we call JSON format. So if you're not familiar with JSON or JavaScript object notation, this is how Power BI is currently storing those formats to represent the files in plain text. Now, in future iterations, I'm hoping that they're going to actually store it in the Tyndall format, which makes it a little easier to read so for the data set. And maybe, and hopefully, the report version of this will be stored in a very similar format to Tyndall, where it's a lot easier to read the changes and also make updates to the files in the plain text editors as opposed to doing it in Power BI in general. All right, so now that you've seen those changes, let's walk through making those changes appear in your Fabric workspace. All right, so to reflect the changes that we've made locally into the Fabric workspace, the first thing we're going to need to do is commit those changes to our local repository and then sync that back to our Azure DevOps repository. So to do that, up at the top here, I'm going to put in my demonstrate changes label, and then I'm going to hit the commit button. And then I'm going to, the next thing is sync those changes. And then we're going to navigate back to our Azure DevOps repository. And if I go to the history button now, you're going to see that that comment that I made has now been reflected. And you can see it actually shows you the same changes we saw locally. You can actually take a look at in the repository in the cloud at the same time. Now, I'm going to also navigate now back to the Power BI workspace. And if I go to click the source control button, you'll see that on the right here, it says it's been modified. And so if I go and hit update all, this could take a couple seconds, so we'll wait. Okay, so the syncing has now completed. The next thing we're going to want to do is make sure that we refresh the semantic model, or the also known as the data set. And the reason we want to do that is because since we're syncing from the Azure DevOps repo, remember that the data itself is not stored in the repository for security purposes. So we need to tell Fabric, Power BI, to go and refresh the data from the upstream data source. So make sure you hit that refresh now button. And once that's complete, let's click on the sample model report and see the changes. You'll see that the tab 2 now is in the Fabric workspace, and if I click back to the first tab, that minor update we made to the DAX measure is reflected down here at the bottom. All right, so in this video I showed you how to set up version control using the PBIP format, syncing that to an Azure DevOps repo, and then synchronizing those changes to the Power BI file to a Fabric workspace. Now, this is a wonderful set of features that Microsoft has introduced to support version control, and version control is a critical component to supporting DataOps principles. And I'm really excited of where Microsoft is going to go with supporting version control even further in the future.
In this next video, we're going to cover the DataOps principle of quality is paramount, and I'm going to show you how to build a testing framework for your Microsoft Fabric project. Testing serves as the safety net for our Microsoft Fabric projects so that when we deploy to production, we're less likely to have errors in that environment. Enjoy.
Alright, now in this demo, I'm going to show you how to weave several of the Fabric artifacts together to build a testing framework for DataOps. In the first couple steps, I'm going to show you how to use the DAX query view, which is a new feature provided in Power BI Desktop, and take testing schemas that I've built to apply to those DAX queries, and then ultimately show you how you take those DAX queries and integrate those into Git, or how they're integrated into Git. All the artifacts and content that I'm showing you in today's demo is provided on my GitHub page. You can download the templates to use. All right, with that, let's move to setting up DAX queries. All right, to get started, what we need to do is turn on a preview feature that was made available in the November 2023 release of Power BI Desktop. So to do that, we need to go to Options and go to Preview Features and select the DAX Query View. This is a new feature that was released in November of 2023. Now, once you hit OK, you may be asked to restart Power BI Desktop. And when you do, you will see a new button on the left-hand side of Power BI Desktop with the letters DAX. So let's click on that. Now, let's take a look at some of the DAX queries that have already been set up in the sample model. The first thing you'll notice is at the bottom we have several that end in a .tests suffix. For the purpose of this demonstration and for the automation, any tests that need to be run through this notebook testing framework, we're going to suffix with .tests. Anything that doesn't have that suffix will be excluded from the automated testing. Now, in each test file is a set of precursors or setup that is establishing the test cases. And in this example, I have a set of measures that are in the model that I want to apply under certain filters. Now, I didn't necessarily come up with all this DAX myself. I leveraged the performance analyzer and copy the DAX that comes out of certain visuals that get built and apply that to the DAX files here. Now, if I scroll down, the common thing that occurs in every one of the test files is the output schema. And that is a set of rows that are put together by the union function. And each row is 3 columns to start with. That is the test name, so what am I testing, the expected value, and the actual value, where I'm pulling in some of the measures in real runtime, what their values are, and comparing them to the expected value. And as I fill out those tests, the last thing I'm going to do is add one more column to the output, which is the past column, which is a Boolean that's comparing the expected and the actual value. So if I run this, what you will see is in the first column is the test name, then the expected value, the actual value, and whether or not all the tests have passed. And in this case, all the values equal to true. So these test cases are in good shape. All right, so let's take a look at another example here, the column.tests tab here. And we're looking at certain calculated columns and columns in the model, and we want to make sure they're meeting certain expectations, whether that they're in a min or max, or they're in a certain range, or they're returning a value under certain conditions. And when I apply those 3 tests, I'm going to uncomment one that I know is going to end in a failure, but I want to show you what it looks like when there's a failure that occurs, so that when I run this, you can see again the standard schema should be always the test name, then the expected value, the actual value, and then finally passed. And this last row, since January 11 does not match bad results, the test has failed. All right, now that I've shown you some of the test examples and the schemas that we use to output the test results, let's go ahead and see what happens when we try to integrate this with Git. So the first thing I'm going to do is save this PBIP file and go back to Visual Studio Code, which we set up in the prior demo. And you'll see that what has changed was the one test case that I uncommented out. So what we'll want to do is commit that. And sync those changes. Now if we navigate back to the Azure DevOps project and we take a look at the sample model.dataset, open that folder up. There's a folder called DAX Queries, and underneath it is all the files that we have as tabs in the DAX query view in our Power BI file. So what's nice about this is the test files can be coupled with the semantic model or data set in Git, and we don't need to keep separate folder structures. Everything's packaged together in one Power BI file when we're working with it on the desktop, but then when we integrate it with Git, it's saved as every individual file so we can leverage that and do version control effectively.
I appreciate you watching the video today. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. And for now, take care.